All right, let me welcome you. Good morning to all who are just joining us now, because we've been on the air for at least 45 minutes now, Emery, almost an hour. But if you are just waking up and you are just tuning in to join us right now here on CBSN, the breaking news that President Trump and the First Lady have tested positive for the coronavirus. Both are now in quarantine at the White House. The commander-in-chief announced the news on Twitter early this morning, saying, "We will get through this together." It comes hours after the president confirmed one of his top aides, Hope Hicks, had tested positive. Well wishes are pouring in from other world leaders, including Russian President Vladimir Putin, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, German Chancellor Angela Merkel are among those who have wished the president a speedy recovery. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, who himself was admitted to the ICU earlier this year after suffering from COVID-19 complications, spoke on camera about the news earlier today. Take a listen.
Well, obviously, I think we all want to send our best wishes to the President and the First Lady, and I've done that this morning, as you can imagine.
All right, for more on this, Charlie D'Agata is joining us from London to talk about what we're hearing from world leaders. And specifically, Charlie, I want to pick up on something that we were talking with Nancy Cordes about, which is, I know that you and we covered Prime Minister Boris Johnson's infection and his recovery. Can you take us through, and I know that there will be differences because we have two different systems of government, but I'm curious to know how a head of state was treated, what the precautions were, what kind of measures were put into place once he became infected, and then specifically when he went into the ICU. What were we looking at as far as the government?
And Charlie, just to add to Vlad's question, also how quickly the general public was made aware of his condition.
Anne-Marie, that's a very good question, and I'll try to get to that in a second, because that's a bone of contention as far as how quickly people knew about it, because Boris Johnson had been diagnosed. He had a positive COVID diagnosis. He himself said he was feeling okay. Remember, this is early on. This is several months ago, not where we are now and the kind of knowledge that we have. So about 48 hours, 72 hours later, his doctors said, against his wishes, that he should go to the hospital. And he was rushed to the hospital. He was taken there to a nearby hospital from Westminster and 10 Downing Street. And then it was touch and go. He spent some time at the ICU for a time. He said himself he wasn't sure whether he was going to have to go on a ventilator. He told President Trump it was touch and go for a time. So it wasn't until much later that we had realized, or the British public had realized, how serious this was. But they had already had a contingency plan in place. Dominic Raab, second in command, you could see it on his face when people were starting to ask questions about his health and his well-being. They were starting to put contingency plans in place. Now, as far as the governance of the UK, that never changed. It never wavered. It never got to the point where somebody took over power, as it were. But they were making contingency plans as to what to do if that should happen. And as we've heard from Boris Johnson himself, it was touch and go, and he has thanked the National Health Services and the nurses and doctors that helped him, literally, for saving his life. And I think what's important, we did another story this morning, when we look at the Boris Johnson situation, we can't make direct parallels with what's happening with President Trump. For instance, Boris Johnson was already suffering from COVID symptoms at that point. We're not sure where President Trump is in that sort of timeline, if you will. However, when he went in, it started this sort of chain reaction as to what would come next. So when he said himself, he had no idea how quickly the COVID would advance. And within several, or excuse me, in his words, a few days, they're already making contingency plans to announce his death.
Wow.
Wow. I know you've been sort of keeping track of what we've been hearing from various world leaders, many of them hoping for a speedy recovery. Anything stood out to you? Has anybody said anything that was less than wishing them well?
Yeah, well, as you would imagine, it comes from the usual suspects. By and large, it's been positive. Thoughts and prayers include the Director General of the World Health Organization. That's important because the president has fallen out with the World Health Organization over COVID. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, he's a COVID survivor himself. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, full and speedy recovery. the French government spokesman, it's the same thing, although he put a dig in there. He said this demonstrates that the virus spares no one, including those who've shown skepticism. Importantly, as you pointed out, Russian President Vladimir Putin sent a direct message to the president. He was released by the Kremlin saying, I hope that your inherent vitality, good spirits, and optimism help you cope with this dangerous virus. Now, the criticism, the usual suspects. Iranian TV has been broadcasting, quite frankly, unflattering pictures of the president surrounded by huge animated coronavirus images. As for China, no official statement yet by the government, but the state-run Global Times said President Trump and the First Lady have paid the price for this gamble to play down COVID-19. It's going to have a negative effect or impact on the image of the president and may affect his reelection.
Charlie, let me ask you about this. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo landed today in Croatia. On Sunday, he is scheduled to travel to Asia. Do we know if these plans are being impacted by news of the president's infection?
Well, first of all, we should note that the Secretary of State said this morning that he and his wife have both tested negative today. He is returning to the United States as planned, and they say they're going to evaluate whether he will then continue the planned upcoming trip to Florida and what should have been or may have been a trip to Asia after that. He says he's got the all clear from medical staff and personnel, but frankly, he's just going to have to evaluate what's needed in D.C. Before committing more to that Asia trip.
So, Charlie, sort of before we let you go, we talked about how Boris Johnson contracted the coronavirus. Also, for the Brazilian president, Bolsonaro also contracted the virus. And, you know, at the time with Boris Johnson, he had been sort of accused of playing down the virus a little bit. His position on that changed. Bolsonaro, for sure, very bombastic about playing down the virus. And his approach to it was to kind of talk about, to work through it and be very vocal. Can we just sort of talk a little bit about how other world leaders have dealt with contracting the virus?
Yes, well, it's a tale of two cities. It's a tale of two countries. It's a tale of two cases. When you look at what happened with Boris Johnson, he readily admits right now that he had severely underestimated the impact of COVID personally on him. He said it was like being trapped by a mugger, whereas Bolsonaro, he had a mild case of COVID-19. And he called it, before that, he called it the little flu. So I can tell you here, because I've been living here through this, it changed entirely the way Boris Johnson and his government looked at the coronavirus, and in terms of, you know, masks, in terms of social distancing, in terms of closing down schools, in terms of locking down the country. It happened very quickly after that. And I'm not just saying that because he was a victim himself, but he started to realize that the numbers that were going up, and having personally experienced the pain and suffering from COVID-19, there was absolutely a change in British politics and policy when it comes to handling COVID-19. Not quite the same case in Brazil. But this is where we do have to point out that there's COVID and then there's COVID. You can suffer very badly, as Prime Minister Boris Johnson did. You may have a mild impact from COVID-19. And that's what we're all trying to decide, all trying to guess. I mean, the world is waiting. Everybody here woke up to that news in the same way you have woken up to the news in the United States that the president and the first lady are now testing positive with COVID-19. And now we wait to see what kind of physical impact it's going to have on them and what kind of political impact it's going to have on the United States and, of course, the rest of the world.
Indeed, Charlie. Charlie Daggett in London, thank you so much.
Thank you.